Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the third Sunday of Advent, also known as Gaudete Sunday, which this year falls on December 12th. For this episode, we have two content warnings. In the deep dive, we talk about the death of children, and in the first reading, we talk about rape and wrongful conviction.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive today is on joy.
Woohoo! As Kay mentioned, the third Sunday of Advent is often referred to as Gaudete Sunday. It comes from the Latin word rejoice. It comes from a particular hymn and piece of liturgy that probably going to totally butcher the pronunciation, but the Latin is Gaudete, Gaudete, Christus est natus ex Maria Virgine? Gaudete. I don't know how to say virgin in Latin. Also not the most important of these. But in English it is...
We're not Catholic. I'm not surprised.
You know. In English it is rejoice, rejoice. Christ is born of the Virgin Mary. Rejoice. And that's just kind of the first beginning part of it. But for a lot of congregations who are very high liturgy, this is kind of where that comes from. So a lot of Episcopalian churches and Catholic churches will use it. But also, one of the things about Advent is there are two different color schemes happening in Advent. We at Nerds at Church go with the blue color scheme. So all of the Sundays in Advent, the color is blue. But it used to be the case that Advent was actually purple, tying it in with Lent. And we've talked about both the seasons of Advent and Lent in our introductory episode where we talk about the church season, so you can learn more there. But they are connected, and for congregations who dive into those connections, they tend to have purple for most of Advent, and then the third Sunday of Advent is pink. So if you see, there are two different ways of doing Advent wreaths, 3 purple and 1 pink, or 4 blue. If you do have a pink one, the day to light it is Advent 3. It is not like the 4th one, it is the 3rd one, which is, not the most important part of it, but it is always this like burst of joy and delight, I think, in the midst of what is very close to the longest night of the year, the darkest time of the year, literally.
Also, I'm pretty sure that at least one of the 4 congregations I'm currently serving has 3 blue and 1 pink candles. Some people just really like joy. Like, that's not a bad thing.
That's true. I have 4 black candles. So
okay.
I am practicing welcoming the darkness for this time. So that's why we picked joy for our deep dive.
Yes. And when we talk about the word joy, we're thinking of a very particular concept. And I am reminded of a time several years ago when I spent a summer sharing a house with 2 African-American women from Texas, colleagues of mine. And we realized several weeks into our time together that one of the reasons why we were talking past each other was because we meant very different things when we used the same words for certain things. And one of those words was joy. When I use the word joy, I'm thinking of a deep thing that wells up from inside you that is grace in your most grief-filled moments, that is hope in the most hopeless moments. It's not Christmas cheer, it's not forced cheer, it's not social obligation polite cheer that you might have at a holiday Christmas party at work. It's not the stiff upper lip or the Midwestern stoic, but this is the kind of thing that keeps you going in your worst moments. And it's got a lot of happy feelings to it, but it's not necessarily what I think of as happiness, which I usually find as more of a fleeting thing. Like, you're momentarily happy because, oh, look, my favorite flavor of ice cream is on sale. Yeah. Which is cool. Like, I'm not knocking it.
I did have Minter Wonderland for the first time this season last night, so that's both a happy thing and there's this like deep joy in my heart of comfort and yeah.
These things still exist. Yay. Whereas for my colleagues from Texas, the word happy covered that concept more so, and the word joy was more of the fleeting cheerfulness that comes from the smaller things in life.
Yeah.
And so we eventually figured out that the reason we weren't understanding each other is because we were almost literally speaking a different language. So that was helpful.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder also about the term, and I don't know the proper pronunciation, but kusalige, which is a Norwegian concept of like deep and profound coziness. So I think of it as like being in a cabin while it's snowing outside in the mountains with like a fireplace going and a cup of hot cocoa, that there is this like depth of like warmth and coziness is kind of
Right.
more how I connect to what we're talking about as joy and what your colleagues were probably talking about as happiness. That there is this like bigger, deeper. It's not as exuberant. It's not as like explosive almost. It's kind of more
But it's very
steady.
steady.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the Norwegian concept, but I believe the Danish word for that is, I am probably going to pronounce this wrong, Hyg, which is Hygge.
Yeah.
And yes, that I think that's definitely related, if not exactly the same thing.
Yep. A lot of Arctic culture, Arctic languages have like some sort of word for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like as we talk about this, it's also interesting to think about where joy comes up in culture. And of course, it's hard to talk about joy and not think of Joy, the character from Inside Out, because in many respects she is embodying joy as your colleagues knew it, and as you and I might think about it as happiness, where she is all bright sunshine, kind of rose colored glasses kind of approach to life at the beginning of the movie, and can't, like, doesn't have space for pain or heartache or sadness, doesn't really have space for the other characters of sadness, disgust, fear, and anger. And that like understanding of what it means to be happy or to have joy falls apart in the course of the movie. And then as the memories get more complex and as the other feelings are able to be incorporated into them, there's this greater depth to which joy reaches and to which the memories are connected, that is more along the lines of like this deeper joy that incorporates like there was this sadness at this point, but also right after that these people cheered us, or like that they're tied together, that and we can't just like separate out all of our feelings to feel like one at a time, and
Yeah.
that is all.
No. That is not how life works.
Yeah.
Life would be a lot easier if it was, but no.
Yeah. That'd be handy. Yeah, so I really appreciate the way that joy kind of morphs from that surface level to that deeper one as a character. I also was thinking about the Doctor Who episode called Blink, which has the terrifying weeping angels, and it's a Doctor Light episode, so the Doctor only has a little bit to do and only shows up a little, and the main character is Sally Sparrow, and towards the beginning she and her friend are kind of exploring this house that's like maybe haunted or something, nobody knows, and there's a quote from her friend that is, "What's good about sad? It's happy for deep people." And I think there's that sense of joy, particularly as we look at Zephaniah, which is written during an exile, or Paul's letter to the Philippians, which is written while Paul is imprisoned, that like there is this like depth of feeling that I think is easy to overlook, but also is so important to hold on to when we talk about joy.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that makes me think of something that definitely confused me when I read this book as a younger child, but as I got older, it made more sense. Many people have heard of the Anne of Green Gables series, and in one of the books, Anne gives birth to her first child, who was a little premature, and because of a lack of medical knowledge at the time, her first daughter dies on the day that she's born. And Anne names her Joyce. And it's made clear in the way that the passage is worded, really, that the reason she named her Joyce was because even though there's this incredibly deep grief that she feels at the loss of this child,
Mm-hmm.
she also got to meet her. Like
Mm.
she had her first child. This was her child, and she got to be a parent, and that's all part of it for her. And so it's along those lines of the whole, you can't just have one emotion at a time. And there is still joy in Joyce's brief life because she got to meet her. So
Yeah. I had a colleague who posted the other day about their kid just got the COVID vaccine,
yeah,
or like the second vaccine or something, and they had had a kid before that who, I think they had been in some accident or something, and something had happened, and the kid lived longer than was initially expected, but also like has died and did not have a
right,
very long life. And yet, in remembering that child, they were remembering joy and gratitude for both of their children, both the one who there was not enough medicine and science to save, for to give a long life to, and the one who is now benefiting from medicine and science by way of the vaccine, of the COVID vaccine.
yeah,
But it's just this like the beautiful way of sitting not in a superficial
right,
feeling of positivity, but a deeper acknowledgement of pain and sorrow and oppression and all of that stuff, and not letting it completely take over, which I think is really, really beautiful.
yeah. There's a phrase that goes around a lot of "don't be sad because it's over, be happy that it happened," or something like that. Be glad that it happened. I see it on various motivational posters and stuff like that, and it can be used in a trite way, but there's also a certain truth to it.
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me of the congregation I served in Minnesota had a wall hanging that they got after the floods of 2007, and it said,
Oof.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it said something like, God doesn't promise that there won't be hard time. I think it was like there won't be hard times, or that there won't be floods. God promises to be with you in the floods and in the hard times. And I really
Yeah.
appreciated that. Yeah. I always appreciate when people can name and acknowledge that, because I think it's really important.
Hmm.
Also, one of the books that I always think of when I think about joy is the book All Joy and No Fun: The Paradox of Modern Parenthood, which I read several years ago and was recommended to me by a friend. But there's this great way that it talks about like parenthood and what it means to be a parent these days is very different than is like acknowledged or publicized basically anywhere, in that it's not that kids will bring you all this like fun and happy times. It is that there is like a deeper joy of being in a rhythm and of watching another small human explore the world and learn. And so it
Sure.
says, instead of like expecting your life to be happy all the time, there's a meaningfulness in your life, that it brings a new meaning to your life, and a new
Yeah.
way of
Being part of
engaging.
someone else's formation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Also, speaking of joy and delight, I just got in the mail, it was a birthday present from my mom, 4 masks from our merch
Aw.
store.
Yay. They look
Ta-da!
wonderful.
They are delightful masks that have this beautiful like thing. It has our logo on the corner. It says Pax Vobiscum on the top, and then has like a wand waving, making spells in stars. And they come in all the liturgical colors, and I'm super excited because I'm doing pulpit supply on Epiphany. And so I will have one that I can wear for pulpit supply. But I am super excited about it, and it is bringing me maybe not the deep joy, but at least some excitement and delight in this moment.
Absolutely.
Ta-da! And I promise not to like record the whole episode in a mask because I'm at home.
I could see that giving us some sound issues. Yes.
But if you want to get your hands on some awesome liturgically appropriate masks or other merch, you can go to bit.ly /nerds@church merch and get some from us or from Horror Nerds at Church. Definitely check it out.
Yes. Also, as far as I'm aware, listening to our podcast while wearing that mask should not present any sound problems whatsoever.
It's true, because in fact, masks do not block you from hearing things.
Right. And I'm even one of those people who will turn down the radio so I can see better while I'm driving. And even I say that. So.
I was going to say, I know people who have taken their masks off to hear better, and I'm like, no.
That's not how that works, no.
Keep me safe. Anyway. Diving into our readings, our first reading is from Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 14 through 20. The prophet Zephaniah calls the people to rejoice with God, who is as a warrior bringing victory, and to gather up the disabled and outcasts in triumph. So one of the themes for this passage is the idea of promised deliverance. Zephaniah is definitely, right, we hear God will do this, God will do that, and so there is this future sense of their promise, which makes sense because they are in the midst of exile. And it reminded me of the Ember in the Ashes series, where there's one prophecy in particular, but there are actually like a bunch of prophecies throughout the series, and they're never quite what they're initially interpreted as. So people think like, oh, this prophecy is about this particular thing happening right now. This prophecy is about this particular emperor who is being put in place in these trials. And then the reality comes around later, and it's like, oh, that prophecy was not about that thing in the past. It's about this thing now. And so I just like that idea of there are promises, and there are promises for deliverance that we receive from God all the time, but they're not necessarily the immediate thing that we are thinking of. It might be more future-oriented.
God's concept of time is not our concept of time.
It's right.
Oddly enough.
Someday we're going to do a deep dive into time, because I love talking about Kairos and Chronos, and wrote a paper on it in seminary.
I'm just interested to see how many verb tenses we can do in one deep dive. But...
That would be fun to just go through all of the different verb tenses. Oh my gosh, that would be so much fun. As we dive into the verses for this passage, in verse 14 we read, "Sing aloud, O daughter Zion, shout, O Israel." And in my head, the TV voiceover person comes on and says, "There comes a time in every show's run when the actors are forced to come clean about the singing and dancing abilities in their resume." And so begins the episode of Zephaniah, the musical.
Really, we do need more Bible musicals. Like, I realize we have some, but there are so many more out there that we could do, and they would be so much fun.
It's true. We, in seminary, 2 different years, one year we did, I didn't do them, but other people did, Katie Luther, the musical, about Katerina von Bora Luther, and the next year they did Solomon, the musical.
Nice.
Or maybe it was off 2 years, but like our next year on campus. Yeah.
Sure.
It was fun.
In verse 15, we read, "The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has turned away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall fear disaster no more." And we're recording this just before it will come out, and this episode. And I cannot help but be reminded of Anthony Broadwater, who recently was freed after being wrongfully convicted decades ago.
And Kevin Strickland was also.
Yes.
Not the Lutheran bishop.
No, this is just the case I've been reading about, because Anthony Broadwater was convicted of raping Alice Sebold, who then wrote a book called Lucky, and she is also the author of The Lovely Bones. Mm-hmm. And I've read both of those. I read The Lovely Bones just because it was interesting fiction, and I read the book Lucky, which is her telling the story of her rape, basically, and the aftermath, and the trial, and all that. I read that for a class on autobiographies in college, and it was a memorable and slightly traumatizing experience. I mean, she did exactly what she set out to do. There are obviously issues with the book, since the guy who was convicted was wrongfully convicted, which we now know. Mm-hmm. But in terms of conveying an emotional experience, she did that beautifully. Yeah. And therefore, don't take it lightly, because, wow, that screwed me up for a while. Just having the wrongful judgments taken away. Yeah. Can be such a gift.
Yeah, I had not heard about Anthony Broadwater. But yeah, Kevin Strickland is local to the Kansas City metro, Kansas, Missouri area. and I did internship there, and so that's the one that's been on my mind. But there's so many wrongful
Yeah.
convictions, and so frequently are connected. I don't know about Anthony Broadwater and Alice Sebold, but so many of them are connected to racism, and
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
And then in verse 19 we read, I will deal with all your oppressors at that time, and I will save the lame and gather up the outcast, and I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. And I feel like I've been referencing the movie Saved a lot lately, but it just seems like such a perfect reference. You have the brother played by Macaulay Culkin in the wheelchair, you have Mary who slowly becomes one of the outcasts, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to wonder if, and then there's the big, everyone gets their just desserts in the end kind of bit in
Mm-hmm.
the end. And I have to wonder if God plans on dropping a lot of giant Jesus
Oh
statues on people as a part of dealing with all those oppressors, because, like, that
my
would be,
gosh.
appropriate,
Can you
I think.
imagine all of the
Yeah.
like manipulative and like exploitative evangelical television pastors getting like a
Like,
giant Jesus just falling on them?
yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, the character who had the giant Jesus statue dropped on her, it scared the crap out of her, but she was okay. It's
Mm-hmm.
not, a violent or, like, horrible death scene or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, I really treasure that memory, so.
Yeah. I need to rewatch Saved. It's been a while.
Yeah, me too.
And I also looked at verse 19, and I was looking at the second half of that where we read, and I will save the lame and gather the outcast, and I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. And I love this. We've done a couple deep dives with different people who are disabled, and one of the things that I love about this particular way it's phrased is this is not I will heal or I will cure. This is I will save the lame and gather the outcast, and the saving is tied into a shift of shame into praise and renown. And so I was just thinking about like that as the actions of accessibility, right? Making spaces more accessible changes the shame that can happen when
Yeah.
places aren't accessible to people into praise, but also like is just an acknowledgement of the humanity of people. And I've seen a variety of places where like hybrid stuff is hard. I will be the first to admit it.
Yeah.
It is really hard to actually do hybrid and not just do a live stream or whatever, but there are places that are like shifting and being like, okay, we're done doing online stuff because the pandemic's over, which A is untrue. There's a new variant. It seems pretty dangerous and pretty unlikely to be affected. Well, less likely to be affected by the vaccines because of all the mutations. But also, like, accessibility should still be there. It should have been there before the pandemic. So
Yeah.
keep the praise and renown in all the earth by continuing to be really intentional about accessibility.
And especially, I was at a meeting of pastors earlier this week where several of them were saying, oh, we have so many people who come to the live stream, but they don't come in person and we never see them. And please don't call people lazy. Please, like, I have found my life to be so much better once I have embraced Brene Brown's concept of assume that the people around you are doing their best.
Mm-hmm.
And everything in your life will get better. And it does.
Yeah.
It's magical.
My pastor once preached that everyone is doing the best they can with what they have and where they're at. And that has
Yes.
been a huge guiding force, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And the thing is, maybe, just maybe, these people aren't lazy. Like, okay, yes, out of the billions and billions and billions of people on the earth, there are probably one or two who are, and goodness knows I have had days like that, and I like them. But, but also, there are people who were just barely making it to your services before, and now their quality of life is so much better because they don't actually have to leave their
Mm-hmm.
house and they don't have to spend that energy on that and they can spend that energy on something else. But before, it was one of the very few opportunities for socialization they had, and so they took it. But now it's an opportunity to actually, like, spiritually grow, and they can actually listen to the sermon instead of being in pain, and you don't know what they're dealing with. So don't call them lazy unless, like, they have literally said to you, oh, I'm just being lazy today, which is a completely different set of
Yeah.
conversations.
Well,
But yeah.
and I know, speaking for myself, I'm not in a congregational call right now, and I've like I'm not ready to be back in person with anybody. Like, Baltimore, where I'm living now, is a very different place than Iowa as far as, like,
Sure.
governmental responsibility and accountability for pandemic response. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's loads better than Iowa. But I still have,
They are actually making an effort.
right?
Yay.
But I
Yeah.
still have all of that anxiety from Iowa and from us living in a state where it was constantly discouraged to do things that are necessary to preserve life, to save people. And I worked as a chaplain in a hospital in that time. And so it's just like, no, I have not been to an in-person worship service indoors ever. Like, maybe in January I've got some pulpit supply lined up, but like, no, that's just like
Sure.
not where I'm at. And some people are immunocompromised. And so unless they can get through all of the hoops to get a test to see if the vaccines have actually had a positive impact in their ability to fight the virus, they might not have the antibodies they need. So there are a million reasons why people are...
Yeah, keep in mind that the pastors I'm talking about in the area I'm in, we have all been back in person for several months now.
Yeah.
And the real question is how many people actually wear masks. But yeah.
And I hear more from pastors talking about lay people who are like, what if we just like get rid of the live stream and then people will have to come back to in person? And it's like, no.
Don't manipulate your people. Don't blackmail them. Don't. No. Also, there is nothing in the Bible that says that your church service can't be at like 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. Just saying. Try it. See what happens.
It's true. It's true. I much prefer a like 5 p.m. Sunday evening worship.
Yeah. Our second reading for this episode is from Isaiah chapter 12, verses 2 through 6, which this episode is taking the place of a psalm.
Mm-hmm.
The prophet Isaiah exhorts Israel to praise God and share God's deeds with the world.
So one of the themes in this passage is salvation, which comes up several times in these lone 5 verses. But
also several times in the Bible.
Also a few more than several times in the Bible. Yes.
Yeah, now and then.
And one of the things that I really appreciate about the way that salvation shows up is that it is almost always an immediate concern. It is like, I think contemporary Christianity has gone too far into salvation being when you die, you go to heaven. And the reality is, both biblically and in basically like any show ever, salvation is like an immediate concern, right? So like in Doctor Who and the Impossible Planet episode, the crew, it's a 2-part episode, but like the crew need rescuing now, not like a month from now, not a week from now. They need it like now.
Yeah.
So, and that's really biblically, salvation is about the here and now, much more than it is about some future far off heaven pearly gates thing.
Sure. So in verse 2 we read, "Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid." And so years ago, the movie Contact came out, and I saw it fairly early and immediately loved it. And so I went out and found the book, which is by Carl Sagan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the movie is dedicated to Carl at the end, because he had just died as the movie was filming.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a scene in the book that didn't make the movie, where Ellie, as played by Jodie Foster in the movie, is with Palmer Joss, the religious guy that they're quasi-dating, and he in the movie is played by Matthew McConaughey.
Mm-hmm.
And she's trying to explain to him how much she trusts and understands science. And they are in a museum, I don't remember which one, it might have been the Smithsonian in D.C., and there is this gigantic pendulum on a chain, and it's enormous and heavy. And I guess like she gets special privileges by being a super scientist or something, or possibly it's after hours or something. But for some reason, she is able to step into the place where this pendulum is, and it's designed so that it traces patterns in the sand underneath it. And she picks up the bottom of the pendulum, pulls it out so that it's at the full range of the chain it's attached to, holds it up to her nose, and then lets it go and lets it swing, and it goes away all the way to the end, and then it comes back all the way. And she does not flinch when it comes near her face, because she understands and trusts science, because she knows that a pendulum will not swing further on the second arc than it has already on the first.
Yes.
And so she doesn't flinch, and that's her explanation to Palmer Joss of how much she trusts science. And that is apparently very similar to the way that he trusts God. So I really, that scene has stuck with me from the book.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I remember watching Contact, I think, but I do not remember it at all. So that's, yeah.
It's also a good movie. Yeah. I have some issues with Palmer Joss's character in the movie because they changed some things around to make him easier to explain, which means that the whole religious theme is just totally watered down and kind of crappy. But that's a whole separate argument for another deep dive, probably. So, yay.
Yeah.
If we ever do a deep dive on religious portrayal in fiction.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my goodness.
We definitely.
Like, Carl Sagan did a great job. That book was fantastic. But
in verse 3 we read, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation and meet your spouse." I love this idea of wells, and I had never thought of it connected to this passage, but in scripture, especially in the Hebrew Bible and in Jewish scripture, the well is like the ancient Jewish Tinder. So it's like where you go to meet your future spouse.
I mean, it's also just like a meeting place in general. Like, people gather there. But,
yes, but like...
But there is definitely a romantic twist to it in the Bible, because people keep meeting their spouses there.
Rachel and Jacob meet there. And then when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well, it's total flirtation. Like, there is so much flirtation. And that gets... We remove the context a lot of the times to our detriment because it's a really fun account of the story. But yeah, so as you're drawing water from the wells of salvation, perhaps you will also draw water for or with your future spouse.
Hey, God has nothing against multitasking.
It's true.
You know, that's fine.
I'm pretty sure God had to multitask in creation and now. There's too many
or for that matter, as Jesus.
Yeah.
Like,
yep.
When God was Jesus, there had to be multitasking because that was a very limited timeline in terms of the way that God thinks about time.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Multitasking God. I like it. And then in verse 4, the second half of verse 4, we read, "Give thanks to the becoming one, call on their name, make known their deeds among the nations, proclaim that their name is exalted." And this reminded me of this thing that happens in the Ember and the Ashes series where someone can be made into the emperor through this thing called they can become the Imperator Invictus, which is when people like proclaim their name and proclaim them Imperator Invictus. And so one person does it like by coercively like gathering people and getting them to do it for her in ways that are super problematic. But then it also happens again in this like really beautiful like acknowledging the deeds of the person and the care of the person for the whole community and the whole nation, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Not that we need like more empire understandings of God, but work with what we got.
And then in verse 6 we read, "Shout aloud and sing for joy, O royal Zion. For great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel." Though not necessarily well. Like, sing loud, but not necessarily well. Not everyone's going to. We get that. God is more interested in intent than skill when it comes to music. And this, as it turns out, made me think of a bit from an episode of Friends where Ross has his keyboarding music and shares it with Rachel. And he has this cheap electronic keyboard that he has set up to have every key, instead of playing a note, it plays a sound effect that is a cheap electronic sound effect. But the thing is, it's terrible. It is so terrible. I do not have
even
words
I
for
know
how bad
it's
this
bad.
is. But yes, like a lot of people have seen this scene because it is such a wonderful display of someone who cares so deeply for something and is so deeply sincere and meaningful about it, and also is terrible, like objectively bad. And the thing is, like, okay, Ross has issues upon issues as a character and as a person, and and like God would definitely not be in favor of some of his other life choices. Oh my goodness. But as far as the keyboarding goes, if Ross were to do that in a way that was shouting aloud and singing for joy to God, I don't think God would actually have an issue with it. Like, other people would, but God would appreciate the deeply sincere nature of that, and that's what comes through. I also will throw in a couple extra comments about singing in church. My dad likes to say that he sings in church because God forgives. And I also have been in many congregations where they do have a person who is terribly off key and sings very, very loud. And the lovely thing that happens when they do that is that everyone else sings a little louder to sort of cover them up. And I have met a couple of people who sing terribly off key and do that on purpose to encourage their congregations to sing louder.
That's fantastic.
which I love
Mm-hmm.
so much, and they don't usually admit that to large crowds of people. Like, usually I hear that because I'm visiting and I'll be gone and I'll never be there again.
Mm-hmm.
But but I love that so much because it encourages the rest of the congregation to not be afraid to sing, because at least they're pretty sure they're not as bad as that person.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's fascinating. I don't do any of those things.
that's okay.
And I know very intimately people who judge people, even pastors, who do those things. Probably not knowing that whether or not the pastor is doing it on purpose. But I do sing joyfully. And as our listeners
Yes.
can attest, that is not necessarily on key at all. I've actually, I'm pretty good with, the very first line of things if it, comes to me to spontaneously sing them. But then I just, drop off.
Well, also, singing alone with no accompaniment, no music, that's a very different thing than singing in a crowd with a lot of other people and the backup music and all that. So I wouldn't hold the standard of that to the standard of do you sing in congregations. But honestly, one of my college pastors was legendary for it. He could not carry a tune in a bucket. And yet he was beloved because he was wonderful with people and he deeply cared about the students. And he was a very decent preacher, but he sang with joy because that's what God wanted, and everyone else sang a little louder to, make sure that the overarching concept was melody rather than that. So
yeah, I definitely sing with joy, but I am not the past. There are congregations that specifically have not called me because they are so intent on having a sung liturgy all of the time and expect the pastor to do that. And I'm like, nah, that's...
I mean, you can absolutely sing the liturgy. The liturgy is designed so that people who aren't particularly good at singing can do it and not, sound terrible
at it. You have that confidence
but also,
in me.
well, but also, I would have some fairly deep questions for those congregations about what do they think the purpose of worship is, for crying out loud.
Yeah, they're frequently congregations that market themselves as progressive congregations. I'm just okay, but
then hire yourself a cantor and have them do it.
Yeah.
But also, worship is not performance. I object. Moving on. This is not what we're actually supposed to be talking about.
Sometimes we just tangent and need to vent about how important it is to not sing on key in worship.
Or to sing whether or not you're singing on key. I'm not telling people to intentionally sing off key, for the most part. Occasionally, there's a moment when it suits. But anyway, moving on.
Our third reading for this episode is Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. Paul encourages his friends to embrace gentleness and peace instead of worrying. So one of the themes in this passage is feelings and emotions that go deeper than the current circumstances. For Paul, his current circumstances are imprisonment. So when he says rejoice, and when he talks about peace and gentleness, he's speaking that from prison under an oppressive empire. But also, kind of we all have those circumstances right now where there's been, still more violence in schools. We're in year 2 of the pandemic that could have been stopped a long time ago. And so the thing that I thought of for this, a friend of mine actually first suggested it, and we've talked about joy a little bit, but is joy from inside out. Not at the beginning. At the beginning, she's super toxic, positivity only has room for optimism, but as she develops and grows and matures, she gets this deeper understanding of what it means to be joyful and to have joy. And that creates something that is more than any given circumstance for the main character. So I just really like that way. Which connects back to our deep dive.
Yeah. So in verse 5, we read, "Let your gentleness be known to everyone, the Lord is near." And my first thought on reading that verse is how rarely we lead with gentleness. That is not usually what first comes to mind for us. But of course, for those who are fans of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, you would know that Fluttershy would have this down. Absolutely no problem.
I was thinking of Mr. Rogers, who is like the epitome
Yes.
of gentleness for me in a lot of ways, but I also love Fluttershy.
Now, wouldn't a time travel episode with Mr. Rogers and Fluttershy be wonderful?
Oh my gosh, I want that crossover.
Yes. I actually had a conversation with someone the weekend of Thanksgiving with a family member about how sad it would be that there's a whole generation of kids now growing up without Mr. Rogers. But the truth is that they're not growing up without Mr. Rogers, because the TV show, Daniel Tiger, is actually based on the Fantasyland from the Mr. Rogers show. And so the concepts are still being passed down, even if Mr. Rogers himself isn't there.
That's awesome.
And I love that. Yeah. And then in verse 7, we read, "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." So, like the way that joy isn't just good cheer or forced cheerfulness, God's peace is also not just calmness either. And this passage made me think of the character of Meg Murray from the book Wrinkle in Time, when she's on the evil-infested planet Kamazatz. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right.
I think that's right.
And she tries several ways to not let the hatred and just like general, this is a technical term, yuckiness of the evil-infested planet to get to her. And so after trying the Lord's Prayer and the multiplication tables, which are both things where she had found comfort before, she ends up just shouting to her dad that she loves him over and over again. And in that, she was able to find peace, and she was able to avoid the infesting hatred and yuckiness of the planet, because even though she was yelling, she was at peace because she had absolutely no doubts that she loved her dad and that her dad loved her too.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I was thinking about it, that verse, and thinking about peace in terms of acceptance. So there is a sense of calm about it, but not calm like no conflict. But instead I was thinking about like Katniss, when she has, this happens multiple times, but when she gets this like moment of clarity where she knows what she needs to do, what needs to be done, and what her purpose is, or why she's doing something, or that she needs to do something, and it is just like, it happens. There's like a acceptance and a clarity, and then she just does it, right?
Yeah, clarity of purpose. Yeah.
So I love that. And but I love those two combinations, because sometimes it is the big Meg yelling that she loves her dad, and sometimes it's the like quiet
surety.
Yeah.
And then our gospel passage for this episode is from Luke chapter 3, verses 7 through 18. John the Baptizer tells the crowd seeking baptism from him to repent and change in response to baptism by being generous, honest, and loving, and then foretells Jesus' arrival.
So one of the themes in this passage is the pairing up or disconnect between actions and faith or words. So John is calling people to make sure that their actions line up with what they're saying as they come to seek baptism and repentance, because not everybody's do. And it reminded me of the Doctor Who episode that took a lot of time and a lot of people, among them Kay and friends of the podcast, Pace and Matt and River and many others, to figure out, because this is hard to Google, what exactly I was trying to think of. But the Doctor Who episode, A Good Man Goes to War, where as the Doctor is, like, in this episode, the Doctor is, like, has this image of himself as, like, a good person who is, like, positively impacting other people, and yet there's this moment where it's that internal conception of self is challenged. And it's pointed out that the Doctor gathers people around him and changes their lives, and then gets them to sacrifice themselves for the Doctor. And so it's pointed out that in the Gamma Forest language, Doctor has actually become a word for mighty warrior. The Doctor has created this reputation of being dangerous and harmful, and so they're scared of him and then want to kill him for good because they are so afraid of the harm that he does. And I think that that's just this like beautiful example of is your internalized sense of self actually accurate to who and how you are in the world? And I think a lot of times it's the opposite, right? Like we don't have as much internal self-love and care and accuracy of our goodness as we actually exhibit with others, especially for folks who are marginalized or oppressed. But there's also this sense of people who think that they're really great, and are you? Or are you exploiting all of your workers to make billions and billions of dollars so you can shoot yourself into space? Jeff Bezos.
And now I'm seeing that gif of Thor talking to Bruce Banner in Thor Ragnarok, I think it was, where Banner, I haven't actually seen the movie yet, so Banner says something and Thor responds, "Is it though?" Or like, really?
Right, but is
and
it though?
That gif makes the constant rounds. And
yes, that is one of the really good ones. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 7, we read, John said to the crowds that came out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" In case you need a reminder of where brood of vipers, what we're really talking about for brood of vipers, you can always check our Nerds at Church episode on biblical cussing, which we'll link to in the episode description. But I am curious when John became a bard and cast vicious mockery, because John does not strike me as a bard. But this is vicious mockery, is a perfect example of vicious mockery.
Well, actually, I don't know. I think if John was going to be any class, bard does not seem inappropriate. Like, talking to people was his big thing.
Yeah, but I also could see, like, ranger or druid. Maybe not. Maybe it is bard. I never thought about that. We're going to have to, like, classify all the
Bible characters
in the Bible. D&D. Yep.
Just when we thought we were done classifying them for Hogwarts houses, right? So I read that exact same verse, and I immediately, in my head, saw the gif of Kevin from Home Alone saying, "Merry Christmas, you filthy animal." And because this year, especially online, I mean, previously also, but mostly, especially this year, I've been seeing people use that gif in a very similar way of just pointing out someone's incredible hypocrisy, or, you know, this is not what Christmas is about. This is not what any of this is about.
Yeah.
And so that immediately popped to mind.
I literally watched that movie last night / very early this morning. Yeah, that's fantastic. In verse 8, John says to those gathered, "Do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our ancestor.' For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham." And we know that stones can become children because we have watched Frozen, obviously. And the trolls in Frozen who live in the Valley of the Living Rock are in fact living rocks.
Yes.
So, you know,
mysteriously,
John's just talking about the troll family. John's just talking about Kristoff's family. That's all.
And rocks that you don't throw at other people, they throw themselves at you.
Yeah, and they're super heavy. So good luck trying to throw them anyway.
And then in verse 14 we read, soldiers also asked John, "And we, what should we do?" And John said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages." So the reason why he had to remind them to not do those things and to be satisfied with their wages is because back then soldiers often did those things and were not satisfied with their wages and were trying to make more money by extorting the people that they ran into. And not that, you know, would ever still happen today. And those comments about the tax collectors, very similar reasons a couple of verses earlier. And this reminds me of a storyline from Star Trek during the Deep Space Nine and Voyager days, when the Maquis, a group of freedom fighters who were mostly either former Starfleet members or Bajorans, fought against the Cardassian occupation of Bajor. The Cardassian military regularly, like, they had an entirely different ethical system than Starfleet or, you know, Earth did. And Cardassian military regularly committed what Starfleet would consider atrocities, what we would consider atrocities. For them, it was like just Thursday. And,
Just
well, I mean, not
Thursday.
actually Thursday, like whatever Cardassian is for Thursday, I don't know. But just another day. And the Maquis formed because they didn't feel that Starfleet wasn't really fighting the Cardassians at first because the Cardassians weren't after anything Starfleet had. They were just hurting people within their own borders or nearby, and Starfleet didn't actually overlap yet. And so the
Sounds
Maquis formed
isolationist. Okay.
because, well, not, yeah, they hadn't gotten there.
Okay.
Was kind of the thing. Like they probably would have gotten there eventually, and actually they do as the story goes on, but it takes them a little while. And so the Maquis form first because Starfleet isn't really paying attention to this, and then later because Starfleet insists on holding to all the classic rules of warfare. And the Maquis are willing to break several of those in order to be more effective, they believe, against Cardassia. But what they eventually realize at the same time is that also by being willing to break several of these classic rules of warfare that Earth and Starfleet have developed over the years, is that they also attract several rather horrifying people into their ranks through that. Like the Maquis are generally fairly altruistic minded and trying to do good, but because they're willing to do certain things that Starfleet isn't, they also manage to attract some people who are there for really terrifying reasons, and that shows up here and there, and especially in fan fiction.
Yeah. I'm sure that doesn't have anything to do with modern military and policing in this country and world.
Of course not.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, it does. It reminds me, that particular example actually reminds me of the West Wing episodes when they assassinate a leader, and it is largely attributed to, well, the rules of warfare have changed, right? Where and that's still true today, right? Russia, before the 2016 election, said they had a weapon that was more powerful than a nuclear bomb, and they meant all of the trolls and bots that they have been doing for cyber attacks. And it's accurate. Like, there's so much misinformation that they could do anything, and enough people would believe it in this country to really cause harm. And so it's like, oh, the rules have changed. And also, they haven't, because the United States has been interfering in elections of other countries basically forever.
Look at Latin America.
Yeah, so it's interesting to see, like, the ways that they change and the ways that it's just, like, our perception of those rules that's changing.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the fourth Sunday of Advent with our special guest and my former professor, Reverend Dr. Vonda Deifeldt. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.